Welcome to the 2024 Comprehensive Guide to Inkscape. Whether you're a graphic designer, illustrator, or hobbyist, this guide will equip you with the skills you need to create stunning vector graphics using Inkscape, a powerful and free open source software. The purpose of this guide is to give you an overview of all of the most useful tools and features of Inkscape, starting from the most basic topics and moving on to more intermediate and advanced topics. This will give you an idea of just how powerful Inkscape is and how you can use it to make amazing artwork quickly and efficiently. So if you're ready, let's fire up Inkscape and get started. When we first open Inkscape, we're normally greeted with the welcome dialog. If, however, yours immediately opens up a new document and you would like to display the welcome dialog first, this is pretty easy to fix. To do so, we need to open the Preferences dialog. On a Mac, there should be an Inkscape menu here at the top left, with a Settings option inside the menu. For those of us using Windows, we can go to the Edit menu and choose Preferences. We should now see the Preferences dialog. At the top left, we have a search box, and if we search for Welcome, we'll see an option down here that says Show Welcome Dialog. If we check this, we can then close the Preferences dialog and the Inkscape document, and the next time we open Inkscape, it should bring up the Welcome dialog. Okay, so the purpose of the Welcome dialog is to allow us to easily customize our document before we create it. For example, in the Quick Setup tab, we can change the appearance of the canvas, which is the drawing area. Changing this won't affect the actual drawings themselves. It's just a personal preference. And like with everything else in the Welcome dialog, we can also change the canvas appearance from inside the document itself, as we'll see in a bit. Next, under Keyboard, we have some options for setting the keyboard shortcuts that Inkscape uses. For example, if you're already familiar with the keyboard shortcuts in Adobe Illustrator or Corel Draw, you can make it so Inkscape uses the same shortcuts. For following along with this course, however, I recommend sticking with the Inkscape defaults for now. Below Keyboard, we have Appearance. The options in here will change the appearance of the icons that Inkscape uses. We can see a preview of the icons here. I'll stick with colorful. Finally, we have the option to switch to dark mode. And as I mentioned earlier, we can actually do all of this from the document itself, so I'll just stick with the defaults for now. In the Supported by You tab, we can learn how to contribute our time and money towards Inkscape's development. Next, in Time to Draw, we have quite a few different templates to choose from. This is useful if we need our drawings to have particular dimensions. For example, in print, we can choose from various paper size formats like A4, US letter, and business card. Under video, we have different video sizes to choose from, in case we wanted to create something like a slideshow for a video. Under social, we have options for creating graphics for various social media platforms. Under screen, we have options for different screen sizes. Shape Builder here has some templates that we can use for creating graphics with the Shape Builder tool, which we'll learn about later in the course. Other has some templates for icons and for creating seamless patterns. Finally, we can create our own custom templates, which will be listed in the Custom category. And with that, we can choose whether or not to show the Welcome dialog every time we open Inkscape, and once we're ready to begin, we can click New Document. When we start up a new Inkscape document, we get this big empty gray area in the center. This is called the canvas, and we can draw anywhere inside it. We also have this white rectangular area in the center of the canvas. This is called the page. The default dimensions of the page are the A4 paper size, and if we had chosen a different template from the Welcome dialog, the page will have the dimensions specified in that template. As I mentioned previously, the page is useful if we need to constrain our drawings to particular dimensions, like if we're creating something like a poster or a PDF document. We can also change the dimensions of the page and its appearance from directly inside the document itself. To do so, we use the Document Properties dialog by going to the File menu and choosing Document Properties. And here we can change the format of the page, which basically contains the same template options we saw in the Welcome dialog. We can also give the page a custom width and height, and switch between portrait and landscape orientation. Under Display, we can set the display units for the document. This is what the document uses to display things like the sizes and positions of objects in our drawings. The default is millimeters, but we can change it to something else like pixels, for example. Next, we have some color swatches. With the page option, we can change the background color of the page. With the border option, we can change the color of the border and shadow around the page. And with the desk option, we can change the background color of the canvas. We can also give the entire canvas a checkerboard background, and we can hide the page border, or we can just hide the shadow. And by the way, the colors of the canvas and page have no effect on the actual drawings. Whenever we go to print or export our drawings, as far as Inkscape is concerned, the canvas and page are completely transparent, so they won't show up in the result. This is all mainly for personal preference. Okay, back in the interface, to the left of the canvas we have the toolbox. This contains all of the tools we need to create and modify our drawings, and we'll be talking about them quite a bit throughout the course. We can resize the toolbox by hovering over the right edge of it until our cursor changes to a double-sided arrow, then clicking and dragging. To the right of the canvas is the Commands bar. This gives us quick access to common commands like starting new documents, importing and exporting, undo and redo, and copy and paste. We also have some more options, which we can see if we click the arrow icon down here. We can also put the commands bar at the top of the interface. To do this, we go to the View menu and uncheck Widescreen. This gives us a bit of extra space for the canvas. Next, above the canvas, we have the Controls bar. The Controls bar contains functions related to the currently active tool in the toolbox. We'll learn about many of these functions as we discuss the individual tools. Below the canvas, we have the Color palette. This provides us with some options for easily changing the colors of objects in our drawings. Finally, we have the Status bar. This gives us some information about things like the colors of the object we're currently working with, as well as about the layer that we're currently working inside. Layers allow us to organize our drawings, and we'll learn all about them pretty soon. On the right side of the status bar, we have options for zooming in and out on the canvas, and for rotating the canvas. We can also zoom in and out by holding down the Control key and scrolling the mouse wheel up and down. And if we go to the View menu, we have some zoom options in here as well. Finally, to move around inside the canvas, we can press down the mouse wheel and move the mouse. In Inkscape, we have three tools for creating basic shapes. We have the Rectangle tool, the Ellipse and Arc tool, and the Star and Polygon tool. First up, with the Rectangle tool, we can of course create rectangles. And after we create one, with the Rectangle tool still active, we get these little handles at the corners of the rectangle. We can use these square ones to change the size. We can also change the size more precisely by coming up here to the Controls bar and entering values for both the width and the height. At the top right corner of the rectangle, we have a couple circular handles. With these, we can round the corners. To remove the rounding, we can come up here and click this Make Corners Sharp button. If we start creating a new rectangle and we hold down the Control key, it will constrain the width to height ratio. We can use this to create perfect squares. Similarly, resizing it while holding Control will also constrain the ratio. And if we hold down Shift as we create one, it will start creating from the center. We can also easily change the color of a shape by selecting it and clicking a color swatch inside the color palette. The next shape tool is the Ellipse and Arc tool. This tool by default lets us create ellipses. And like with rectangles, we get some square handles for adjusting the width and height. Now the ellipse, of course, doesn't have corners, so the circular handles work a bit differently than they do for rectangles. If we drag one around the outside of the ellipse, we can create a Pac-Man or a slice of pie. And if we drag inside the ellipse, we can create arcs. Now if we look up here to the right of the controls bar, we have these 4 buttons for changing the shape, including slice, arc, and chord. With arcs and chords, we can't tell the difference between them unless the shape has a stroke around it. To put a stroke around a selected shape, we can come down to the color palette, hold Shift and click a color. A stroke is basically an outline around the outside of the shape. To change the width of the stroke, we can come down here to the status bar where it shows the fill color, the stroke color, and the stroke width. If we right-click the stroke width, it will bring up some options for changing it. Okay, so with chords, the stroke also goes along the flat portion of the shape. With arcs, on the other hand, the stroke doesn't appear at the flat portion. We can see this even better if we turn off the main color of the object, which is called its fill color, by coming back down here and clicking the big red X. Alright, now I'm going to set the fill color again, and I'm going to turn off the stroke color by holding down Shift this time before clicking the red X. Finally, back up here, we have this button for making the ellipse whole again. And like with rectangles, we can hold Control to constrain the width to height ratio, which will let us create perfect circles. And we can hold Shift to draw from the center. Now let's check out the Star and Polygon tool. By default, this tool creates 5 cornered stars. To change the number of corners, we just come up here and adjust the corners setting. With stars, we get these 2 diamond handles. With the inner handle, we can adjust the base radius. This will also skew the star unless we hold down the Control key. With the outer handle, we can adjust the tip radius as well as rotate the star. Holding down Control will stop it from rotating. The spoke ratio setting up here is for adjusting the base to tip radius ratio. We can also round the corners using the rounded setting. Or we can just come over to one of the handles and drag it while holding Shift. And finally, we can randomize the angles and corners either with this setting or by dragging a handle while holding down the Alt key. Now you're probably thinking this is a lot of keyboard shortcuts to memorize, but fortunately, all we have to do is hover over a handle and look down at the status bar, and it would tell us what the handle does, as well as what keys we can press to perform particular functions. Alright, and to easily get back to the default 5-cornered star, we can click this Reset button up here. Now if we come back over to the left of the controls bar and click the Polygon button, it will change the shape to a 5-cornered polygon. Like with stars, we can adjust the number of corners, and we can round and randomize the corners. Finally, if we start creating a new star or polygon, we can hold down Control to snap the angle of rotation to 15-degree increments. Whenever we have overlapping objects, there will likely be times when we want to change the order in which they appear on the canvas. This is called the stacking or Z order. For example, I might want to put this rectangle on top of the ellipse, or send the triangle here all the way to the bottom. To do this, if we have the selector tool here active, in the controls bar we have these 4 buttons: raise to top, raise, lower, and lower to bottom. If I grab the rectangle, I can bring it to the top by clicking the raise to top button. If I grab the ellipse, I can make it so it's just above the triangle by clicking the raise button. And if I click it again, it will also be on top of the rectangle. I can move it back down a step using the lower button. Finally, if I grab the rectangle here at the top, I can send it to the bottom of the stack using the lower to bottom button. Another way to manage the stacking order of objects is through the use of layers. By default, we start out with a single layer, which, as we can see in the status bar, is called Layer 1. All the objects we have so far are all inside Layer 1. If we come up here to the Layer menu, we have a lot of options for working with layers. However, the easiest way to work with layers is by using the Layers and Objects dialog, which we can open by clicking Layers and Objects here. This opens up what's called a dockable dialog here on the right. We can change the width of a dockable dialog by clicking and dragging it from the left side. And we can see other available dockable dialogs by clicking the arrow button here. We'll cover some more of these dialogs throughout the course. In the Layers and Objects dialog, we can see Layer 1 in the list here, and if we expand it, we can see all the objects inside the layer. And we can actually change the stacking order of the objects from here either by selecting one and clicking one of these arrow buttons, or by simply dragging them to different positions in the list. Another thing we can do is hide objects and lock objects. If we lock an object, we won't be able to select it or move it around. We can hide and lock entire layers as well. Now to add a new layer, we click this button with the plus sign. This brings up a little Add Layer dialog where we can give the layer a name, and we can choose whether to put it above, below, or as a sublayer of the current layer. If we go with above and click Add, we can see the new layer above Layer 1 in the list. And now it's the active layer, so if we create a new object, it will be added to the new layer. And because the new layer is above Layer 1, its objects will always stay above Layer 1's objects. If we want to put them below Layer 1, all we have to do is grab Layer 2 in the list and drag it below Layer 1. Now if we drag the layer inside Layer 1 and release, it becomes a sublayer of Layer 1. This basically means that hiding or locking Layer 1 will hide or lock both layers. Another thing we can do is drag objects into different layers. And if we want to remove an entire layer, including all of its objects, we can choose it in the list and click the trash button. Now sometimes, we might want to keep certain objects together that are inside the same layer. For this we use grouping. To group objects, we select them, then right-click and choose Group. We can also group from the Object menu and with the Group button in the Commands bar. The grouped objects are now treated as a single object, as we can see by the single bounding box around them. Also in the Layers and Objects dialog, the objects have been combined into a single item in the list, labeled with a G for Group. We can expand the group to show the objects, which allows us to select the individual objects again. If we want to add more objects to the group, we first need to right-click it and choose Enter Group. Now any objects we create will be placed inside the group. To get back out of the group, we can either select an object that's outside of the group, or we can use the Selector tool to double-click the canvas. And an easier way to enter inside a group is to double-click the group itself. Finally, if we want to ungroup all of the objects, we can get back outside of the group, then right-click it and choose Ungroup. The Selector tool, as we've already seen, allows us to select objects and move them around. We can also select multiple objects by dragging a selection box all the way around them. Then we can move the objects together. And if we click an empty area in the canvas, it will deselect the objects. Another way to select multiple objects is to select the first one, then hold down Shift and select the others. And if we want to easily select all objects, we can use the shortcut Ctrl-A. Something else we can do with the selector tool is scale selected objects by dragging around these scale handles at the sides and corners. If we hold down Ctrl as we do this, it will maintain the width to height ratio. And if we hold down Shift, it will scale in the opposite direction as well. We can also rotate and skew selected objects. To do this, we click the selection, which changes the handle types. Now the corner handles let us rotate it. Holding down Alt snaps the angle to 15-degree increments. And holding Shift rotates around the opposite corner. The side handles let us skew the selection. And again, holding Alt snaps the angle, and Shift skews from the opposite side. Now when we rotate or skew an object, it does so around this little crosshair, which is called the rotation center and is by default located at the center of the object. However, we can move the rotation center somewhere else, then rotate or skew around that point. To put the rotation center back at the center of the selection, we can hold down Shift and click the rotation center. And if we click the selection again, it will switch us back to the scale handles. We also have some buttons up here in the controls bar for transforming objects. We can rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise, rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, flip it horizontally, and flip it vertically. Let's say we want to make copies of an object. One way to do so is with copy and paste. For this, we can right-click the object and choose copy, then right-click somewhere else and choose paste. Another way is by duplicating. To duplicate, we right-click the object and choose duplicate, which creates a new copy directly on top of the original object. With both of these options, the copies are not connected to the original object in any way. This means changing the appearance of a copy won't affect the original object or vice versa. But sometimes we might want to make it so that changing the original will also change the copies. For this, we use clones. We can again do this from the right-click menu by choosing Clone. Now changing things like the color, size, and rotation of the original will also change the clones. And if we want to unlink a clone from the original, we select the clone, then go up to the Edit menu, then down to Clone and choose Unlink Clone. This is now a standalone object, so changing the original won't affect it. In order to make our design layout look nice, we might want to align and arrange the objects in certain ways. To do this, we use the Align and Distribute dialog, which we can open by going to the Object menu and choosing Align and Distribute. In this dialog, we have quite a few options for aligning objects, but before we do this, we need to select some objects, and we need to define the anchor by using this Relative To box. Basically, the anchor will stay in place, and the other objects will move relative to it. Among the possible anchors to choose from, we have the last or first selected object, the biggest or smallest selected object, and the page. For example, with last selected as the anchor, if I first select these two smaller circles, then select the biggest one will be the anchor. So now if I click, for example, the Align Left Edges button, the big circle stays in place and the smaller circles move so that their left edges align with the big circle's left edge. Similarly, I can center the smaller circles vertically in the big circle and horizontally. If I choose Page as the anchor, I can align the circles to the page in various ways. For the most part, I like to keep the anchor on Last Selected. We can also use the Align and Distribute dialog to distribute the amount of spacing between selected objects. For example, we can put equal horizontal spacing between them, as well as equal vertical spacing. Now, if we would rather be able to align objects directly on the canvas, we can do so with snapping. To enable snapping, we can come up here to the top right of the canvas and toggle on this button. Now as we move objects around, we get all of these lines that let us align things like the sides and centers of objects. And we can also snap together particular points of objects, like their corners or the quadrant points of ellipses. If we come back up to the Snap Controls button and click the arrow next to it, we get this popover that lets us enable or disable bounding box snapping, node snapping, which includes the corner points of stars and the quadrant points of ellipses, and we have an alignment option. Alignment is what brings up the red lines that let us align and distribute the objects on canvas. I find this gets pretty annoying after a while, so I like to keep mine turned off. And if we click on Advanced Mode here, we get full control over the types of snapping we want to use. For example, we might want to snap together the rotation centers of objects. We can also see in this list that we can snap to the borders of the page. And finally, if we click Reset to Simple Snapping Mode, it brings us back to the simple popover. The shape tools are great for quickly creating basic shapes, but as our designs become more complex, we'll need more control over the shapes that we use. This is where paths come in. And like with the shapes, we have three main tools for creating paths: the pen tool, the pencil tool, and the calligraphy tool. First, with the calligraphy tool, we can easily draw calligraphic or brush strokes. In the controls bar, we can change the width of the stroke. With the cap setting, we can add some rounding to the ends of the stroke. We also have a lot of presets here that we can choose from, which use different settings and give us different types of brush strokes. Above the calligraphy tool, we have the pencil tool. With the pencil tool, we can draw freehand paths. And if we want, we can turn off the fill color and give it a stroke. By default, the paths we draw with the pencil tool are pretty jagged, but we can fix that by coming up here to the controls bar and increasing the smoothing setting. Now the paths will be much smoother. Okay, now let's check out the pen tool, which is the most useful tool for creating paths. With the pen tool, if we click some points, we can create connected line segments. And to finish creating the path, we can either click the first point again to create a closed path, or if we want to leave the path open, we can either right-click or press Enter. We can see that this is an open path because the stroke doesn't connect the two endpoints. We can also give the path a fill color. Now if we want to close the path, all we have to do is click one endpoint, then click the other one. If we start creating another path, we can click and drag to create a curved segment. We now get these two circular handles at the cursor, which are called Bezier handles, and which let us adjust the curvature of the segment. When we release the mouse, it locks in the curvature at that segment. Then we can create more curved segments, or we can go back to creating straight line segments. While creating a curved segment, if we hold down the Control key, it will snap the rotation angle of the handles to 15-degree increments. And if we hold down Shift while creating a curve, it gives us control over the positioning of the handle that's under the cursor. This lets us create sharp corners. One thing that distinguishes paths from shape objects in Inkscape is that all of the segments of a path are connected by little points called nodes. To see and access the nodes, we have to use the Node tool located here under the Selector tool. With the Node tool active, we can now see a selected path's nodes, which are indicated by these square or diamond-shaped handles. We can select the node and move it around. If we hold down the Control key, it will constrain the node's movement to either the horizontal axis or the vertical axis. We can also select multiple nodes either by dragging a selection box over them or by holding Shift and clicking them. The diamond-shaped handles denote corner or cusp nodes, and the square-shaped handles denote curved or smooth nodes. If we select a smooth node, we can see its Bezier handles, and we can use the handles to adjust the curvature. There will likely also be times when we want to change a smooth node into a cusp node or vice versa. For this, we have these 4 buttons up here. With the first one, if we have a smooth node selected, we can turn it into a cusp node. We can now adjust each Bezier handle individually, allowing us to create sharp corners. With a cusp node selected, we can click the next button up here to turn it into a smooth node. This forces the handles to rotate together, keeping the segments curved. The next 2 buttons are for creating symmetric nodes and auto smooth nodes. These 2 types of nodes are basically just glorified smooth nodes. With symmetric nodes, not only do the Bezier handles rotate together, but they also maintain the same distance from the node. This is useful when we want to curve 2 segments of a path by the exact same amount. And finally, with an auto smooth node, as we move the node around, the handles will adjust automatically in order to keep the curves very smooth. We can also add nodes to a path or delete nodes from a path. One way to add a node is to first select 2 or more nodes, then click this button in the controls bar, which adds a node right at the midpoint between the selected nodes. An easier way to add nodes, however, is to simply double-click a segment using the Node tool. And to delete selected nodes, we can just press the Delete key. We can break apart a path at a selected node by clicking this button. The path is now an open path. And if we select 2 nodes, we can click this button to join them together at the midpoint. Or if the nodes aren't connected, we can click this button to add a line segment between them. And we can click this one to delete the segment. As I mentioned earlier in the lesson, paths are made up of nodes, but shape objects are not. For example, if we create a rectangle and grab the Node tool, we still just get the rectangle's scale handles and its corner rounding handles. However, we can change a shape object into a path. To do this, we can either click this button in the controls bar for the Node tool, or we can go to the Path menu and choose Object to Path. We now get a cusp node at each of the rectangle's 4 corners. And we can now treat the rectangle like any other path, so we can move the nodes around, we can change the node types, and we can add extra nodes. One thing to keep in mind when changing shape objects into paths is that we lose the handles for adjusting certain aspects of the shape. For example, we no longer have the corner rounding handles. Fortunately, however, we can still easily round the corners of a path. To do so, in the controls bar for the Node tool, we have this Add Corners LPE button. If we click it, we now have these circular handles near each node. And we can click and drag them to round the corner at that node. We can also select multiple nodes and round them at the same time. This function actually adds a path effect to the path. Path effects are very powerful, and we'll learn much more about them later in the course, including other things we can do with this particular path effect. But for now, when we're finished using a path effect, it's usually a good idea to lock in the path effect adjustments by turning the object back into a normal path. We do this the same way that we turn shape objects into paths by going to Path, Object to Path. The rounding handles are now gone, and we get access to all of the path's nodes. In the Path menu here, we have a bunch of operations that we can perform between selected paths and shapes. For example, if we have 2 or more paths or shapes selected, and we perform the union operation, it turns them all into a single path. If any of the original objects were overlapping, their nodes get combined together. Next, if we have two overlapping objects, we can use the difference operation to cut the top one out of the bottom one. It also completely removes the top shape. With the next operation, intersection, we can get just the overlapping parts of the selected objects. The next operation, exclusion, is kind of like the opposite of intersection, as it'll remove only the overlapping parts of the objects. Next up is division. Division is similar to difference in that it will cut the top object out of the bottom one. However, it also leaves the overlapping parts as separate paths. The next operation, cut path, does almost the same thing as division, except it only cuts the bottom object's stroke into pieces, completely removing its fill color. We now have two open paths here. Next is the combine operation. Like with union, we can use combine to turn multiple objects into a single object. However, unlike union, even if the objects are overlapping, they will become subpaths. We can see that they're subpaths because they have separate strokes, and we can use the node tool to move them apart. After combine, we have break apart. Break apart is basically the opposite of combine, as it will separate the subpaths that are inside an object. For example, if we take some shapes and combine them together into a single object, and later decide we want to separate them again, we can use break apart. One nuance with break apart, though, is that if we have a path with enclosed empty areas like this, and we do break apart on it, it will fill in the empty areas. And we now have multiple paths, one big filled in path, and a separate path for each of the enclosed areas that were filled in. The next operation, split path, is also for separating subpaths. However, if the subpaths are overlapping, split path has no effect. Another difference between split path and break apart is that if we do split path on an object with enclosed empty areas, it won't fill in those areas. Next up, we have fracture. If we use fracture on some overlapping objects, it uses the overlapping parts to cut the objects into fragments. The final Boolean path operation we have is flatten. If we perform flatten on some overlapping objects, it removes all of the overlapped parts. This is similar to the difference operation, except it can be used on more than two objects at a time, and it doesn't delete the top objects. Often in our designs, we'll need everything to have a certain layout and proportions, especially if we're working on something like a poster or an ebook. This is where guidelines and grids come in. First, to create guidelines, we'll need the rulers at the top and left of the canvas to be visible. If you don't see yours, you can go up to the View menu, then down to Show Hide and check Rulers. And now to create horizontal guidelines, we can drag down from the top ruler. To create vertical guidelines, we can drag from the ruler on the left. And to create diagonal guidelines, we can drag from one of the corners, being careful not to click directly on any of these buttons. Now if we turn on snapping and take a look at the advanced mode, we by default have a guidelines option turned on. This means that as we create and move around objects, we can snap them to various points along the guidelines. If we hover the mouse over a guideline, the cursor will turn into a hand icon. And if we click and hold on the guideline, we can reposition it. This also repositions the guideline's origin point, which is indicated by this little circle. This is one of the points on a guideline that we're able to snap to. It's also the point around which we can rotate a guideline. To rotate a guideline, we hold down the Shift key as we hover over it, which turns the cursor into rotation arrows. And if we click and drag now, we can rotate it. If we want to move the guideline's origin point without moving the entire guideline, we can hold down Control before clicking and dragging. Now we can rotate around the new point. If we double click on a guideline, it brings up the guideline dialog. And here we can give the guideline a label. We can change its color. We can set the origin point and the angle, and we can lock the guideline. If we now click the OK button, it applies the new settings. We can see the guideline's label near its origin point, and the origin point is now an X instead of a circle. This means the guideline is locked, and we can no longer move it around. If we want to lock all of the guidelines, we can come up to the Edit menu and check Lock All Guides. If we uncheck the option, it will unlock all the guides. We can also toggle guideline locking on and off by using this lock icon here between the rulers. To remove a guideline, we can either drag it back to a ruler, or while hovering over it, we can press the Delete key. And to remove all guidelines at once, we can go to Edit, Delete All Guides. Next, to add a grid to our document, we can go up to the View menu and check Page Grid. This creates a default 1 pixel by 1 pixel rectangular grid across the entire canvas. And like with guidelines, with snapping turned on, we can by default snap to grids. If we want to change the settings of the grid, we have to use the Document Properties dialog, which we can open by going to File, Document Properties. In here we choose the Grids tab, and now we can do things like create a new rectangular or axonometric grid. And we can adjust the settings of the current grid. If we disable the grid, it no longer has any effect in our document, as we can't see it and we also can't snap to it. But if we enable it and turn off its visibility, we can't see it, but we can still snap to it. At the moment, we're only able to snap to visible grid lines. The grid actually consists of both major grid lines and minor grid lines. And when we're zoomed out like this, we can only see the major grid lines, which are by default located at every 5 grid units. If we toggle off this option here, we can also snap to the invisible minor grid lines. To actually see the minor grid lines, we have to zoom in quite a bit. The minor grid lines are more transparent than the major ones. Over here we can adjust the spacing between the grid lines. We can also change the origin of the grid. With a default of 0, 0, the grid is flush with the top and left sides of the page. We can also align it to particular points on the page using these buttons. Now let's come up here and check out the axonometric grid option. If we click the New button right now, it will actually create the grid on top of the existing grid. We now have a tab here for each of the 2 grids in our document. This can get pretty confusing, so let's remove the first grid by selecting its tab here and clicking the Remove button at the bottom. Now we just have an axonometric grid. With an axonometric grid, we can create isometric designs. And for the settings, we can set the origin, we can change the spacing, and we can adjust the angle on both the x-axis and the z-axis. Finally, if we want to hide all of the grids in our current document, we can go back to the View menu and uncheck Page Grid. So far in the course, we have been using the color palette to change the colors of objects. And if we use the arrows here on the right, we actually have quite a few colors to choose from. We can also use this hamburger icon to choose from lots of different palettes. We can configure the color palette as well by clicking Configure here. With this, we can change the size of the color tiles. We can change their aspect ratio. We can stretch them so that they fill up the entire bar. We can change the width of the border between them. And we can change the number of rows of tiles in the palette. We also have this enlarge pen colors option, which is on by default. Pen colors appear all the way at the left of the palette. And by default, we have the remove color button, and we have black, 50% gray, and white. If we want to add a different color to the pen colors, we just have to right-click the swatch and choose pen color. And now it has moved over to the pen colors. To remove a pen color, we right-click it and choose unpin color. Okay, so we can obviously do quite a lot with colors just by using the color palette. But if we want much more control over colors, we need to use the Fill and Stroke dialog. To open the Fill and Stroke dialog, we go to Object, Fill and Stroke. And here we have a Fill tab, a Stroke Paint tab, and a Stroke Style tab. With the Fill tab, we can adjust the fill color of selected objects. By default, we're using the HSL color mode. With this mode, we can adjust the hue, which is basically another word for the actual color. We can adjust the saturation, which is the purity of the color. The lightness, which is how dark or bright the color is. And we can adjust the alpha, which is another word for opacity. We also have the option of using a color wheel to adjust the color. The bar along the circle is for changing the hue, and the small circle inside the triangle is for changing both the saturation and the lightness. Some other color mode options we have are RGB, which stands for red, green, and blue, and CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and is useful for printing. The default fill color type is flat color, which means a single fill color across the entire object. We can also turn off the fill color by clicking the X here, and we can apply gradients and patterns to the fill, which we'll take a look at in upcoming lessons. The Stroke Paint tab is basically the same as the Fill tab, except we can use it to adjust the stroke color. With the Stroke Style tab, we can adjust other features of the stroke. For example, we can change the stroke width. With the dashes, we can apply various dash or dot patterns to the stroke. We can adjust the offset of the pattern using this box. And we can even apply our own custom pattern. Each pair of numbers we put in here is the length of a dash followed by the length of a gap, and the pattern then repeats itself along the stroke. With markers, we can apply different icons like arrows along the nodes of an object's stroke. We can even adjust things like the size of a marker, its orientation, and its offset on the stroke. And if we click this Edit on Canvas button, we get handles on the canvas for adjusting the marker's properties. Under Markers, we have Join, which lets us change the appearance at the corners of an object's stroke. We can see this better if we turn off the markers and the dashes. The default is Miter Join, which gives the stroke sharp corners. We can also choose Bevel Join and Round Join. With Cap, we can change the appearance at the endpoints of the stroke. The default is Butt Cap, which squares off the stroke at the node. We can round off the stroke using Round Cap, and Square Cap is like Butt Cap, but it extends a bit beyond the node. Finally, we can change the order in which the fill, the stroke, and the markers are drawn. By default, the fill is drawn first, then the stroke on top of it, then finally the markers. We can change the order using the other buttons, but I almost always keep mine on the default, as changing it can lead to some unexpected results. If we go back to either the Fill tab or the Stroke Paint tab, we have this eyedropper button here at the very bottom. With this, we can change an object's color to any color we choose from the canvas. The eyedropper button actually temporarily switches us to the dropper tool here in the toolbox. If we hold down Shift and choose a color, it will set the selected object's stroke color to the new color. We can also click and drag over some colors to choose an average of all the colors. Holding Shift as we do this will do the same for the stroke. Finally, at the bottom of the Fill and Stroke dialog, we have Blend Mode, a Blur slider, and an Opacity slider. Blend Mode affects how the colors of selected objects blend with any colors underneath it. For example, we can darken the underlying colors, or we can lighten them. With the Blur slider, we can blur the object. This by default blurs the object in all directions by the same amount. However, if we now go to the Node tool, we can see these two circular handles at the top and right side of the object. With these, we can adjust the horizontal and vertical blurring separately. And finally, with the Opacity slider, we can change the object's opacity. Unlike with using an alpha slider, which only affects the opacity of either the fill or the stroke, the opacity slider affects the entire object. As we saw in the previous lesson, in both the Fill tab and the Stroke Paint tab of the Fill and Stroke dialog, we have a number of buttons for changing an object's fill or stroke type, with flat color being the default. Two other options we have are Linear Gradient and Radial Gradient. Let's start with Linear Gradient. If we have an object selected and we click the Linear Gradient button inside the Fill tab, the object gets a gradient going from fully opaque on the left side to fully transparent on the right side. Back over here, we now see a gradient line, and on the line, we have two sliders, which are called stops and which represent the colors of the gradient. The one on the left is the opaque stop, and the one on the right is the transparent stop. We can click and drag the stops to move them around, and it would change the appearance of the gradient on the object. We can also switch between the stops using the list here, and we can change the color at the chosen stop. And if we want, we can bring up the opacity of the transparent stop. If we hover over the gradient line, the cursor turns into a plus sign, and if we double click, we can add a new stop. We can move it around, and we can change the color. To remove a stop, we can select it and press delete. We can also reverse the direction of the gradient by clicking this button here. And using the repeat option, we can change how the gradient gets repeated along the object. However, we can't see the difference between these unless we make it so the gradient line doesn't cover the entire object. And to do so, we use the Gradient tool here in the toolbox. With the Gradient tool active, we now see the gradient line and the stops on the object itself. And we can do the same things we can do in the Fill and Stroke dialog, like move the stops around and change their colors. However, using the Gradient tool, we can also now rotate the gradient line, and we can make it so the line is completely inside the object. And with this, we can now see how changing the repeat option will affect the appearance of the gradient. We actually also have both the repeat option and the reverse option in the controls bar for the Gradient tool. Now let's learn about radial gradients. To apply a radial gradient to a selected object, we can either click the radial gradient button in the Fill and Stroke dialog, or with the Gradient tool active, we can come up here next to New and choose the Create Radial Gradient option, then double-click the object. Radial gradients by default start at the center of the object and have both a horizontal gradient line and a vertical one. And the lines are kind of like mirrored versions of each other. This means they always have the same number of stops, and if we change the color of a stop on one line, the color of the corresponding stop on the other line will change as well. This also goes for moving the mid-stops around. If we click and drag one of the ending stops, we can adjust the length of the line, and we can rotate the entire gradient. If we want to adjust the length of both lines together, we can hold down Ctrl and Shift. Using the center stop, we can move around the gradient as a whole. We can also change the color at the stop. Another thing we can do is if we hold down Shift before clicking and dragging the center stop, we can change what's called the focus of the gradient. The focus is now indicated by this X here. If we want to put the focus back at the center, we just have to drag it to the center stop until it snaps into place. Alright, and as I mentioned before, we can also apply gradients to an object's stroke. We can do this either by using the buttons in the Stroke Paint tab of the Fill and Stroke dialog, or again we can come up to the Controls bar, and next to New we have a Stroke Gradient option. And we can choose either Radial Gradient or Linear Gradient, then double-click the object. The object now has another gradient line, which we can use to edit the stroke gradient. Next to the gradient options in the Fill and Stroke dialog, we have a Pattern button. If we click the one in the Fill tab, it will apply a pattern to a selected object's fill. To change the pattern, we can use this drop-down here to choose a particular category of patterns, or we can just choose all patterns to view them all. And now we can pick from all of the available patterns. Below the list of patterns, we have a lot of settings for changing the appearance of the current pattern. For example, we can change the scale. With orientation, we can change the angle of the pattern. We can also use the slider here to change it by 15-degree increments. The offset setting lets us change the positioning of the pattern on the object. And with the gap settings, we can add gaps between the repetitions of the pattern. For most of the patterns, we can also change the color by clicking the color swatch here and adjusting the sliders. Finally, if we click the Edit on Canvas button here, we get some new handles inside the object, which we can use to adjust the pattern. With the top left handle, we can change the offset. With the bottom right one, we can change the scale. Holding down Ctrl will change the scale proportionally on both axes. And with the circular handle at the top right, we can rotate the pattern. Holding down Ctrl will snap the angle to 15-degree increments. We can also actually see what objects were used to create a particular pattern. To do this, we give an object whichever pattern we want to check out, then we go to Object, Pattern, Pattern to Objects. This turns the selected object into the pattern objects, and it might move it to a weird location for some reason. We can now see that this simple path was used to create the pattern. Also, although the path appears to be black, if we take a look in the Fill and Stroke dialog, it says Paint is undefined, and this question mark button is turned on. This button unsets an object's color. We can also see here in the status bar that the path's fill color is unset. This is important to know because if we want to create our own patterns and be able to change the pattern's color later through the Fill and Stroke dialog, we'll need to first unset the colors of any objects that we use to create the pattern. Let's go ahead and see how we can do so. First, we can create one or more objects that we'll use for the pattern. If we want the pattern to always be a particular color or colors, we can apply some colors to the objects. However, if we would like to be able to change the color of the pattern later, we'll need to select the objects and click the question mark button here in the Fill and Stroke dialog. And we can also lower the opacity if we want. This will still work just fine. Now, to turn the selected objects into a pattern, we go back to Object Pattern, but this time we choose Objects to Pattern. This turns the objects into a pattern, then it creates a rectangle and applies the pattern to it, as we can now see in the Fill and Stroke dialog. We should now be able to edit the pattern settings, but if it doesn't work, we can first apply a random pattern to the object, then choose our custom pattern again from up here, and now the settings should work. And because we unset the colors of the pattern objects, we can change the color here. We can also create a new object, and if we click the Pattern Fill button, it should automatically apply our new pattern to it. Using strokes isn't always ideal when creating vector designs, particularly when working with Boolean path operations. For example, I have a circle with a stroke here, and let's say I want to use this rectangle to cut out just the part of the circle's stroke that is overlapping. If I select them both and go to Path Difference, it doesn't give me the result I'm looking for. This is because a stroke is basically just a style for an object and not part of the actual object, but path operations work on the objects themselves. And if I go to the Node tool, I can modify the nodes of the underlying shape, but I can't change anything about the stroke. If I wanted to modify the stroke, I would first need to turn it into a path. To do this, I can either click this button in the controls bar for the Node tool, or I can go to Path, Stroke to Path. We can now see in the status bar that the object has just a fill and no stroke, and I have access to all of the nodes surrounding what used to be the stroke. I can also now cut things out of it. One more thing to note is that if we do stroke to path on an object that has both a fill and a stroke, it gives us a group of two paths. If we ungroup it, we have a path consisting of just the fill and a path for what used to be the stroke. If we want to add some text to our designs, we use the Text tool here in the toolbox. To create text, all we have to do is click in the canvas and start typing. To change the font, we can come up here to the controls bar and choose from all the font families installed on our computer. Or if we already know which font family we want, we can just start typing it here and it should pop up. We can also change the font style, as well as the size. We can actually also change the font attributes of just certain parts of the text by selecting them first. And this whole piece of text is actually an object, so if we go to the Selector tool, we can resize it using the scale handle. However, if we want to stop the text from getting distorted, we have to hold down the Control key. We can also rotate it and skew it. And of course, we can change the fill color of the text, and we can even add a stroke to it. If we go back to the Text tool, we can still edit the text like normal. Back up in the controls bar, we can adjust the spacing between the baselines of the text. With this drop-down, we can change the text alignment. If we select one or more characters, we can use this button to make them superscript, or this one to make them subscript. If we click the spacing button here, it brings up some different options for changing the spacing of the text. And these actually work differently depending on whether or not we have any text selected. For example, with the first box, we can either adjust the spacing between only the selected characters, or with nothing selected, we can adjust the spacing between all the characters. Using this box, we can adjust the spacing between entire words. We can also select parts of some words and only adjust the spacing between those words. With these two boxes here, we can adjust the kerning, which refers to the spacing between individual pairs of characters. If we have nothing selected and we change, for example, the horizontal kerning, it moves all the characters that are to the right of the cursor. The vertical kerning box works in a similar way. Finally, with this box, we can rotate the selected characters by a specified number of degrees, or with nothing selected, it would just rotate the character that's to the right of the cursor. Next, we can use these three drop-downs to change the direction of the text in different ways. Back over at the left of the controls bar, we have a Font Collections button. Font Collections let us group certain font families together. Document fonts and recently used fonts are the default collections provided to us by Inkscape. If we check the box next to one, the font family drop-down will now only show the fonts in that collection. To go back to showing all the available fonts, we can click this Reset button. To edit an existing font collection or create a new one, we need to click this button to open up the collections editor. And here we can see all the available font families and all the font collections, including the fonts inside them. To create a new collection, we click the plus button down here, type in a name, and press enter. We can then simply drag and drop fonts into the collection. Now we can use our new font collection here. We also have a text and font dialog that we can work with. To open it, we can go to Text, Text and Font. In the Font tab of the Text and Font dialog, we can change a text object's font attributes like we can in the controls bar for the Text tool, but with the added benefit of seeing a preview of how the changes will look. Also, in order to actually apply the changes to the selected text object, we have to click the Apply button here. We're also able to set the chosen attributes as the defaults that will be used whenever we create new text objects. In the Features tab, we have some advanced settings we can work with, like checking out the different ligature types in the font and using different types of capitalization. Finally, using the Text tab, we can edit the actual text. And this also provides us with a spell checker. Because a text object is not a path, if we go to the Node tool, we don't have access to the nodes of the text. However, just like with shapes, we can turn a text object into a path by going to Path, Object to Path. This combines all the characters into one big path. Now we can modify the nodes. One thing to be aware of, though, is that because this is no longer a text object, we can't use the Text tool to change the text or the font attributes. After turning the text into a path, if we want to separate the letters, we can use either the break apart or the split path operation. As we learned earlier in the course, if we use break apart, it will separate the subpaths, but it will also fill in any enclosed empty areas. If that's not what we want, we can instead use split path. And we can now apply different colors to the individual characters. However, break apart and split path only separate letters that aren't touching. If we have a text object that uses a script font and we turn it into a path, then use either break apart or split path, it doesn't separate any of the overlapping characters. To fix this, if we undo until it's a text object again, we can first go up to the text menu and choose Text to Glyphs. This converts all the characters into separate text objects. And now if we want, we can turn them all into paths. One more thing to know about changing text objects into paths is that if the text object has multiple lines, using object to path turns each line into a single path, then groups all of the paths together. If we ungroup it, we now have access to each of the paths. If we have a text object and a path, we can make it so the text follows along the curvature of the path. To do this, we select both objects, then go to the text menu and choose Put on Path. And the text object is now connected to the path. So if we move the path, the text object moves with it. And if we modify the path using the Node tool, the text will adjust in order to continue following along the curvature. We can also still modify the text using the Text tool. If we want to remove the text object from the path and make it go back to being a normal text object, with the object selected, we can go to Text, Remove from Path. However, if we undo all of that, and instead we want to keep the text like it is, but be able to remove the path, we have to turn the text object into a path first. This means we can't modify the text using the Text tool anymore, but now we can delete the path. The Put on Path function works with shapes as well. For example, I can select a text object and a circle, and use Put on Path to wrap the text around the circle. At the moment, however, it's hard to get the text perfectly centered on the circle. To fix this, I can remove the text from the circle, and before putting it back on the circle, I'll set the text alignment to centered. If I now wrap the text around the circle, I can get it perfectly centered at the top by rotating the circle while holding down the Alt key to snap the angle. It's also possible to wrap the text along the bottom of the circle. To do this, I just have to flip the circle vertically. However, this also puts the text inside the circle, squeezing the letters together, so I'll likely need to make some spacing adjustments. And again, I can turn the text object into a path, then get rid of the circle. If we have a text object selected and we have the Text tool active, we can see this diamond-shaped handle at the bottom right of the text. If we click and drag this, it will create a box around the text and will force the text to stay within the bounds of the box. This is called flowed text. Another way to create flowed text is to click and drag in the canvas when creating a text object. If we deselect the text object and select it again, we again have the diamond handle at the bottom right for adjusting the size of the box. However, we now also have a square handle at the top right. With this, we can add some padding between the text and the box. The box around flowed text is called a frame, and we can actually use custom shapes for the frame. To do this, we first need a text object and a shape. And the text object, by the way, has to be a normal text object, not a flowed one. Now we can select both objects and go to Text, Flow into Frame. And like with Put on Path, the text is connected to the frame, so moving the frame will also move the text, and changing the shape of the frame will cause the text to readjust automatically. If we want to turn flowed text back into a normal text object, we can select it and go to Text, Unflow. Or like with Put on Path, we can undo that and instead turn the text object into a path, which will keep it the way it is and allow us to delete the frame. If we have some flowed text and a separate shape, we can select both the text object and the shape and go to Text, Set Subtraction Frames. This will cause the text to flow around the shape, as we can see if we move the shape onto the text. And we can even do this with multiple shapes at a time. However, we first have to select the text object and all of the shapes that we want to use, then do Set Subtraction Frames. One way to import an image into our document is to go to the File menu and choose Import. We can also copy and paste images into the document, and we can even drag and drop them into the document. Regardless of how we import an image, we get a dialog where we can choose how we want to add the image to our document. The two import types we can choose from are Embed and Link. With Embed, the image will be embedded into the document. This means that if we later delete the image file from our computer or change its location, it won't affect the document. It also means that if we save the document and send it to someone else, the image will also be included in the document file. A disadvantage of this, however, is that if we use a lot of large images, the document file size can get pretty big. With the link option, on the other hand, the image in the document will be linked to the image file on our computer, and Inkscape will load up the image file whenever we open the document. This means that we can add a lot of images to our document without increasing the file size too much, but we have to be careful not to delete or move the image files, or else Inkscape won't be able to find them. For the most part, I tend to stick with the embed option. Alright, and after we import an image into our document, we will sometimes want to trace a part of it so that we'll have a vectorized version that we can use in our designs. To do this, we can first lower the opacity of the image, then we can grab the pen tool and start tracing. And we could just manually create Bezier curves like this, but with a complicated image, this can get pretty tedious. So instead, if we look up here in the controls bar, we have several modes that we can choose from. The default is the Bezier mode, which we've been using so far, and which lets us create curves by clicking and dragging. But we also have B-spline mode here. With this one, we just have to click points, and it will automatically create curves for us. It's not quite as accurate as Bezier mode, but in most cases, I find it works well enough. When we're done with the tracing, let's make sure to go back to Bezier mode, and now we can raise up the opacity of the path and make it whatever color we want. We can also delete the image if we no longer need it. If we only want a particular part of an image to be visible, we can use clipping and masking. To do so, we first draw a path or a shape over the part of the image that we want to keep, then select both objects. And for clipping, we can either go to the Object menu, then down to Clip and choose Set Clip, or we can right-click the selection and choose Set Clip. And this is treated as a single object, so we can transform it like a normal object. To release the clip, we can either select the clipped object and go to Object, Clip, Release Clip, or we can just right-click it and choose Release Clip. Masking is very similar to clipping, except it takes the color of the mask into account. A black mask will make the result fully transparent. A white mask will make it fully opaque. A 50% mask will make it 50% opaque, and so on. For example, if I wanted to use the shape to clip the image again, but I also wanted to make the image go from transparent on the left to opaque on the right, I could first make the shape black, then give it a linear gradient, and make the stop on the right fully opaque and white. Now I can select both objects, and I can either go to Object, Mask, Set Mask, or right-click the selection and choose Set Mask. And to release the mask, we could again either use the Object menu, or right-click and choose Release Mask. Clipping and masking work on other types of objects as well. For example, I can use the same shape to clip or mask another shape. One menu we have in Inkscape is the Filters menu. Filters allow us to add various effects to any object, and they tend to work particularly well with images. For example, in the bevels category, we can make the object look like a button, or we can add some diffuse lighting to it. A useful filter in the blurs category is feather, which lets us blur just the edges of an object. The color category lets us affect an object's colors in different ways, such as by using colorize to completely change the colors, or using lightness contrast to affect how bright or contrasting the colors are. With the image effects filters, we can apply a film grain to an object, and if we have an image that is kind of blurry, we can use sharpen or sharpen more to bring out the details a bit. In the morphology category, we can add an outline to an object, with many options for changing the appearance of the outline. With overlays, we can add effects on top of an object. For example, we can add clouds, or frost, and we can use noise fill to add a noise overlay to an object, giving it a grainy appearance. Under shadows and glows, the filter I use more than any other is drop shadow. With this, we can add a drop shadow either to the outside of an object or to the inside. We can also apply multiple filters to an object. For example, we might want to give it an outline and also give it a drop shadow. And if we want to remove all of an object's filters at once, we can go to Filters, Remove Filters here at the bottom. One of the tools we have available to us is the Shape Builder tool here. This tool, as its name implies, allows us to build shapes, and to use it, we first need to have some shapes or paths selected. If we now activate the Shape Builder tool, it hides everything on the canvas that isn't selected, and it turns all of the selected objects gray and puts an outline around each one. If we move our cursor over the objects, whichever segment we hover over turns a light shade of blue, and if we click the segment, it turns a darker shade of blue. This means that the segment will be included in the shapes that we're building. We can also click and drag over segments, and they will be combined into a single segment, with the outlines between them disappearing. If we take a look in the controls bar, we have two modes to choose from, Add Mode and Delete Mode. Add Mode is the default, which lets us add segments, and with Delete Mode, we can delete segments. However, we don't actually have to enable Delete Mode from here. Instead, with Add Mode still enabled, we can hold down the Shift key to temporarily switch to Delete Mode. We can tell that we're on Delete Mode because the cursor has a minus sign next to it, whereas with Add Mode it has a plus sign next to it. And with Delete Mode active, the segments we hover over turn pink. And if we click one, it disappears. Also, similar to Add Mode, we can click and drag over segments to delete them all at once. However, we don't actually need to delete segments, because any segments that aren't blue when we apply the result will automatically get deleted. And to apply the result, we can either click the checkmark button here next to Finished, or we can press the Enter key. And now we have all of the different shapes that we built. Now if we undo all of that until we have the original objects back, and we select them all, activate the Shape Builder tool, and start building, we can undo a previous action by pressing Ctrl Z. Also, if we want to cancel the building altogether, we can either click the X button up here, or we can press Escape. In the lesson for the Welcome dialog, we briefly saw that one category of templates that we have is Shape Builder. We can use these templates along with the Shape Builder tool to build a variety of shapes. And instead of closing out of Inkscape and opening it back up to get to the Welcome dialog, we can actually access all the templates by going to the File menu and choosing New from Template. Now we can go to the Shape Builder tab, choose a template, and click Create from Template, and it will start up a new document using the selected template. Now we can select everything, grab the Shape Builder tool, and get to work. One very useful feature of Inkscape is path effects, which are special effects that we can apply to paths and shapes, and which can speed up our designs quite a bit. To use path effects, we need to open up the Path Effects dialog, which we can do by going to the Path menu and choosing Path Effects. And now with a path or a shape selected, if we click this arrow here, we can see all of the available path effects. There are quite a lot of them, so in this lesson, we'll just go over some of the ones that I find to be the most useful. First, we have corners. This is actually the path effect that gets applied to an object when we go to the Node tool and use the Add Corners LPE button here. If we click it, we can see in the Path Effects dialog that the object now has the corners path effect applied to it. As we've seen before, with the corners path effect, we have circular handles near each of the object's nodes, which we can use to adjust the rounding at the corner near that node. But with the Path Effects dialog open, we also have some other settings that we can play around with. For example, using this radius box, we can adjust the rounding radius of all the corners at the same time. Or if we select some nodes and check this Change Only Selected Nodes option, we can adjust the rounding at just the selected corners. Also, instead of holding Ctrl and clicking a handle to cycle between the different corner types, we have these buttons for changing the corner types. For example, we have Fillet, which is the default. We have Inverse Fillet, which inverts the rounding. We have Chamfer, which squares off the corners. And we can use this chamfer step setting to change the appearance of it. And finally, we have Inverse Chamfer, which is the opposite of chamfer, and which is also affected by the step setting. If we apply the Offset path effect to a shape or path, and we go to the Node tool, we get this orange circular handle that we can use to either outset or inset the object. We can also change the join type, which affects the appearance of the corners. Miter is the default, and it keeps the corners sharp. We can also square off the corners using Beveled, and we can use Rounded to round the corners. Offset is particularly useful for creating a border around one or more objects. For example, I'll first duplicate these two objects, then I'll union the duplicates together, make it a different color, and send it below the original two objects. Now I'll apply Offset to it, and use the Node tool to outset it, creating a border for the objects. The Power Stroke path effect is useful for paths that only have a stroke. If I apply it to this path, the ends of the path by default become tapered. And if I go to the Node tool, I now have these pink diamond handles at different points along the path. These are called control points, and I can move them around and use them to adjust the width of the path near that point. If I hold Ctrl and click a control point, it adds a new one. Holding Ctrl and Alt and clicking one deletes it. Using the width multiplier setting, I can adjust the width of the entire path. Changing the smoothing type will affect the appearance of the path in different ways. Using the two cap settings, I can change the appearance at each endpoint of the path. If we apply the bend path effect to a shape or path, and we click this Edit on Canvas button, we get a green horizontal line going across the center of the object. If we click and drag the line, we can bend the object. We can also move around the nodes at the two ends of the line, and use the Bezier handles to adjust the curvature. And if we double click the line, we can add a new node to it. We can adjust the width of the object using this handle here, which we can also do from the Path Effects dialog. Pattern along path lets us stretch or repeat a shape or path along another path. To use it, we first need to copy the object that we want to use as the pattern. Next, we select the path we want to put the pattern on and add pattern along path to it. And in here, we need to click one of these two buttons. The main difference is that Link to Path in Clipboard will allow us to modify the original pattern object and have it also affect the pattern, whereas with Paste Path, modifying the original object won't affect the pattern. So let's go with Link to Path in Clipboard. The default pattern type is single stretched, which takes a single copy of the pattern object and stretches it along the path. And we can change the color if we want. Another pattern type is single, which just puts a single copy of the object at the start of the path. And we also have repeated and repeated stretched. Repeated will repeat the object along the path as many times as possible, and repeated stretched will stretch the copies so that they fill up the entire path. Some other things we can change are the width of the copies, the spacing between them, and their offsets on the path. The perspective envelope path operation allows us to either change the perspective of an object or deform its shape. The default type is perspective, and if we now go to the node tool, we have these four nodes at the corners of the object's bounding box, and we can use them to change the object's perspective. We can make it so the movements get mirrored horizontally and or vertically. If we change the type to envelope deformation, instead of changing the object's perspective, the nodes now let us deform its shape. And again, we can mirror the movements. In order to use interpolate subpaths, we first need to have an object that consists of multiple subpaths. To do this, we can select two or more objects and go to Path, Combine. If we now add interpolate subpaths to it, it interpolates between the subpaths, by default giving us a total of 5 subpaths that have an equal amount of spacing between them. We can change the number of subpaths using the step setting. Also, if we use the node tool to modify one of the original subpaths, all of the interpolated subpaths will get modified accordingly. If we click this Edit on Canvas button here, it gives us a green horizontal line across the object. This is the line along which the interpolated paths are created. We can click and drag the line to bend it. We can also move the nodes at the ends of the line, and we can even add new nodes to it. If we add the mirror symmetry path effect to a path or shape, it will mirror the object along a mirror line. And we can use the node tool to change the position and angle of the mirror line using these nodes. Also, if we change the shape of the original object, the mirrored version will change accordingly. Changing the colors will also by default affect the mirrored version. However, if we check split elements here, changing the original's colors won't affect the mirrored version, and we can now also select the mirrored version and change its colors separately. If we add the splice path effect to a shape or path, it will slice the object along a slice line, which by default goes vertically along the center of the object. And like with mirror symmetry, we can use the node tool to reposition and rotate the line. And what's cool is we can also use slice on a group of objects. With the tiling path effect, we can repeat a path or shape in a ton of different ways. We can change the way that the tiles are mirrored. We can change the number of rows and columns. We can adjust the gaps between the tiles. We can offset alternating rows or columns by a certain percentage. We can change the scale of the tiles in different ways. And we can rotate the tiles in different ways. Also, if we split the elements, we're able to select the individual tiles and give them different colors. We can actually also add multiple path effects to a single shape or path. For example, I might add the bend path effect to this object and bend it. Then decide I also want to add the offset path effect to it. When an object has multiple path effects attached to it, we can click and drag on these little dots here to change the order of the path effects, which can change the appearance of the final result. We can also use this eye icon to toggle a path effect on or off. And we can use the trash icon to remove it. One more thing to know about path effects is that it's pretty easy to accidentally change their settings, especially if we start making transformations on an object that has them, or we start grouping them together with other objects. Because of this, when we're finished adjusting an object's path effect settings, we'll often want to finalize the settings. To do this, we just have to do object to path on the object. Any path effects that the object had disappear from the path effects dialog, but the results remain on the object. The object is also now a normal path, so we get access to all of its nodes. Because path effects only work on paths and shapes, if we try to add one to a text object, it doesn't let us. In order to use path effects on a text object, one thing we can do is first turn the text object into a path. We can of course do this by going to Path, Object to Path like normal, but if we have the Path Effects dialog open, we also conveniently have a Convert Text to Paths button. If we click it, the text object becomes a path, and now we can add path effects to it. Of course, once we turn a text object into a path, we can no longer change its text or its font attributes. But we have a way around this, which is to first create a clone of the text object, then apply path effects to the clone. And if we select a normal text object, we again conveniently have a clone button in the path effects dialog. If we click it, it creates a clone of the object directly on top of it. And we can now add path effects to the clone. But what's cool about this is that if we change the text or font attributes of the original text object, the clone will change as well. However, there's a bug that causes the final character to not show up in the clone. To fix this, all we have to do is add some extra character like a space to the very end of the text object, which fixes the clone, and now we can remove the extra character. Now if we select the clone again, we can see in the path effects dialog that the clone also has the clone original path effect attached to it. This was added automatically by Inkscape. Under the clone original settings, we can actually change what aspects of the original object that the clone copies. By default, the clone copies the original object's shape along with its LPEs, which are its path effects, and it also copies some of its attributes, including its style, its clip path, and its mask. Now because the clone copies the style, if we change the original object's colors, the clone's colors will change as well. However, if we remove the word style in here along with the comma after it and press enter, now changing the original object's colors doesn't affect the clone. And we can freely change the clone's colors. We can also create multiple clones of a text object. To do this, we can either clone the text object itself again, or we can simply duplicate the clone. This also duplicates the path effects. I can now change the color of this clone, move it below the other one, add the offset path effect, and outset it, creating a border for the other clone. And modifying the original text object will modify both clones. And again, we might have to add and remove an extra character in order to update the clones. Another very useful feature of Inkscape is extensions, which are located in the Extensions menu. And like with path effects, we have a lot of them, so we'll only cover some of the most useful ones. First up, in the color category, we have Randomize. If we check Live Preview down here, we can use this extension to randomize the colors of selected shapes or paths in different ways. For example, we can randomize the hue, the saturation, the lightness, and the opacity. To cancel the extension results, we can click the Close button, or we can click the Apply button to permanently apply the results. The Generate from Path category has quite a few useful extensions, and the first one we'll look at is Distribute Along Path. This extension works similarly to the Pattern Along Path effect, except instead of copying the pattern object into the clipboard, we need the pattern object to have a higher Z order than the path that we'll place copies onto, and we need to have both objects selected. If we check Live Preview, the default behavior is to place multiple copies of the pattern object along the path, with no space between them. We can also see by looking at the gradient that each copy rotates in order to follow the orientation of the path. To stop this from happening, we can uncheck Follow Path Orientation here. Now the copies maintain the same rotation as the original pattern object. If we check the next option, it will add just enough space between the copies to fill up the entire path. Or we can instead use the Space Between Copies setting to manually adjust the spacing. This also works with negative numbers. With the normal offset setting, we can adjust the vertical offset of the copies on the path. And with the tangential offset, we can slide the copies back and forth along the path. With the Extrude Between Two Paths extension, we can connect the nodes between two selected shapes or paths using either lines or polygons. If we apply the extension, the polygons or lines are placed inside a group. We can change the colors of the group as a whole, or we can ungroup it and work on the individual objects. The next extension we'll look at, Interpolate Between Paths, requires that we have two or more paths selected. So if we want to use it on shapes, we have to turn them into paths first. Now if we open up the Interpolate Between Paths dialog and check Live Preview, it interpolates between the paths by creating new paths between them. We can use the Interpolation Steps setting to tell it how many paths to create between each pair of selected paths. We can change the method it uses to interpolate between the paths, and we can tell it whether or not to interpolate between the styles or colors of the paths. With the long shadow extension, we can easily apply a long shadow effect to a selected path or shape. We can adjust the length of the shadow as well as the angle, and if the object has a stroke, we can use the stroke color as the color for the shadow. We can also use this on text, but we have to turn the text into a path first. Also, to easily get back to the previous extension, we can either choose Previous Extension Settings to bring up the dialog again, or we can choose Previous Extension to apply the same extension using the previous settings. And by the way, applying the long shadow extension gives us a group of two objects. If we ungroup it, we now have both the original object and a group of shadow objects. The Pattern Along Path extension does basically the same thing as the Pattern Along Path effect, except with the extension, we can use a group of objects as the pattern object. And like with the Distribute Along Path extension, the pattern object needs to have a higher Z order, and we need to have both objects selected. Like with the path effect, we can choose how to place the pattern object onto the path. We also have a deformation type setting. Snake makes the copies rotate along with the path direction, whereas ribbon keeps the copies upright, creating more of a ribbon appearance. We can also adjust the spacing between the copies, as well as the offsets. A useful extension in the text category is Lorem Ipsum, which lets us easily create placeholder text. If we have nothing selected, it flows the text inside the page borders. We can adjust the number of paragraphs, as well as the number of sentences in each paragraph. With the fluctuation setting here, we can randomly add or subtract up to a specified number of sentences from each paragraph so that they don't all have the exact same number of sentences. If we apply the extension, we can see that it creates a text object, and we can change its font attributes. Also, if we run the extension with a shape or path selected, it will use the object as a frame for the text. We touched briefly on clipping and masking earlier in the course, but there are actually a few more cool things we can do with them. For example, if we go into the Object menu, for both clipping and masking, we have inverse options. With inverse clipping, we can cut the top object out of the bottom one. This is similar to using the difference path operation, except like with normal clipping, we can always release the clip to get the original objects back. With inverse masking, the color of the top object affects the transparency of the part of the bottom object that it covers. Like with normal masking, the closer to black, the higher the transparency. Another difference with inverse clipping and masking is that they actually both use path effects. This means we're not able to use them on images like we can with the normal clipping and masking. If we open up the path effects dialog, we can see that inverse masking uses the power mask path effect. And in here, we can invert the mask, we can hide the mask, and we can remove the background. Another feature we have is clip groups. To create a clip group, we right-click an object and choose Set Clip Group. What this does is it clips the object with itself, then puts it inside a group. And what this means is that if we enter into the group, any objects that we create will also be clipped. And if we resize the original object, We'll also resize the clip. If we would like to vectorize a raster or bitmap image and use it in our designs, we can use the Trace Bitmap dialog. To open it, we can either go to Path, Trace Bitmap, or we can right-click the image and choose Trace Bitmap. And here we have three tabs, Single Scan and Multicolor for vectorizing normal images, and Pixel Art for vectorizing pixel art images. The main difference between Single Scan and Multicolor is that Single Scan will give us a single path, and Multicolor will give us a group of multiple paths. We can also see in the preview box here that the multicolor result will be much more detailed than the single scan result. And for each tab, we have a variety of detection modes to choose from, which will give us different results. For single scan, the parts that are black in the preview will be included in the result, and the white parts will be removed. We can invert this by checking Invert Image here. We can also use the threshold setting to increase or decrease the amount of detail in the result. And when we like what we see in the preview, we can apply the result by clicking the Apply button here. This creates a new path on top of the image. And like with all paths, we can do things like change its color and perform path operations on it. As I mentioned before, the multicolor tab will give us a group of paths, and the number of paths it gives us is determined by the scan setting. A default of 8 gives us 8 paths, and we can change this to add or remove detail from the result. Applying the result also takes a bit longer than single scan because it has to scan the image multiple times. We now have a group of paths, and we can enter into the group to edit the individual paths. We previously went over linear gradients and radial gradients, but we actually have another type of gradient that we can use called mesh gradients. And we can apply one to a selected object by clicking the Mesh Gradient button in the Fill and Stroke dialog. Mesh gradients go from white at the top left and bottom right corners to the original color at the bottom left and top right corners. If we grab the Mesh tool over here, we can select one or more corner nodes and change the colors. We can also move the nodes around, as well as use these handles to adjust the curvature of the mesh. To add more nodes to the mesh, we can double-click a vertical segment to add rows, or a horizontal segment to add columns. We actually have another type of mesh gradient called a conical gradient. To access it, we have to create another object, then go back to the Mesh tool, choose the Conical Gradient button in the controls bar, and double-click the object. Like with radial gradients, conical gradients start from the center and move out. And we can double-click segments to add rows and columns. With the Paint Bucket tool located here in the toolbox, we can fill in what are called bounded areas. A bounded area is an area that is completely surrounded by pixels that are different from itself. For example, the red rectangle here is completely surrounded by the white pixels of the page. And if I click the rectangle with the Paint Bucket tool, it creates a new path on top of the rectangle and fills it in with the color of the Paint Bucket tool. That's not particularly useful, but if we have overlapping objects, all of the overlapping parts that have the same color as the pixel I click will get filled in. we can also use it to fill in empty areas that are completely surrounded by objects. And we can easily change the color of the new path either using the color palette or the fill and stroke dialog. This also changes the color of the paint bucket tool, so any new paths we create with it will use the new color. And because this works on pixels, and because Inkscape uses anti-aliasing to smoothen out the pixels on the edges of objects in the display, if we zoom in a bit, we can see that the tool doesn't perfectly fill in the areas. And actually, being zoomed in will give us a better result, as it gives the tool more pixels to work with. We also have this grow shrink by setting. If we use a positive value for this, it will expand the path. And if we use a negative value, it will shrink the path. The threshold setting determines how closely the neighboring pixels must match the first pixel. For example, these two overlapping objects that are different shades of red, if we use a low threshold and click one of the bounded areas, it will only fill in that particular area. But if we increase the threshold, we're able to make it fill in both areas. We can also use the fill by setting here to tell the paint bucket tool to only consider a particular color channel of the pixels. For example, with alpha, as long as all the overlapping objects have the same alpha or transparency value, they will all get filled in. With the tweak tool here, we're able to sculpt and scatter selected shapes and paths in various ways. For example, with the default move mode, if we click and drag over the objects, they will move in the same direction as the cursor. We can also use the width setting to control how large of an area to affect. And we can use the force setting to control how much force to apply to the objects. With the next mode, clicking and dragging will move the objects toward the cursor. And with most of the modes, we have the option of using the Shift key to perform the opposite action. For example, with this mode, holding down Shift as we click and drag will push the objects away from the cursor. We can use the next mode to scatter the objects in random directions. With the next one, we can either make the objects shrink or hold down Shift to make them grow. Next, we can either rotate the objects clockwise or hold Shift to rotate them counterclockwise. The next mode will duplicate the objects. Holding down Shift with the duplicate mode will delete the objects. With the next mode, we can push parts of the objects in different directions. We can use the next one to either shrink parts of the objects or hold Shift to enlarge them. The next mode will either pull parts of the objects toward the cursor or push them if we hold Shift. Next, we can roughen up the edges of the objects. With the next mode, we can make the colors of the objects get closer and closer to the color of the tool. Using the next mode, we can apply random colors to the objects. Finally, we can use this mode to either increase the blur of the objects or hold Shift to decrease it. Using the spray tool here, we can either spray duplicates or clones of selected objects, or spray them as a single path. The width setting allows us to change the size of the spray area, and the amount setting lets us change how many copies to spray. Rotation, which goes from 0 to 100%, lets us apply a random rotation to the copies. Similarly, scale lets us apply random scaling to the copies. With a high scatter setting, the copies are scattered all around the spray area. With a low scatter and a low focus, the copies will stay near the center. And with a high focus, they will stay near the border. When both of the eye buttons here are turned on, we're able to spray over both transparent areas and non-transparent areas. If we turn on just the open eye button, we're only able to spray over non-transparent areas. And if we turn on just the closed eye button, we can only spray over transparent areas. We can use this button to prevent copies of the same color from overlapping. And we can use this one to prevent all copies from overlapping. Turning on this button gives us some options for affecting the colors of the copies. For example, with this one, we can apply the background color to the fill color of the copies. And with this one, we can apply it to the stroke color of the copies. We can also invert the color using this button. If we activate the eraser tool here, we can either delete objects that we click and drag over, or using the cut mode, we can cut through parts of the objects. We can use the width setting to adjust the width of the tool. If we use a positive value for thinning, dragging fast will make the width smaller. Using a negative value will have the opposite effect. With caps, we can round the ends of the tool. Trimmer will roughen up the edges of the tool. And with a high mass, the tool will lag behind the cursor, allowing us to get a smoother result. Because cut mode actually cuts through the objects, we can only use it on shapes and paths. We can't use it on images. But if we turn on clip mode here, instead of actually cutting through the objects, it uses clipping. So now we can use it on images. It can sometimes be useful to work with multiple pages in our document, especially if we want to create something like a PDF file. To create and manage multiple pages, we use the Pages tool located here in the toolbox. If we activate the Pages tool, we can create another page with the exact same dimensions as our current one by simply coming up to the controls bar and clicking the New Page button. We can also choose a specified format for the selected page, or just resize it manually using the handles at the corners. We can use the circular handles to adjust the margins for the page. We can do this from the controls bar as well. And we can also snap objects to the page margins. If we click and drag a page using the Pages tool, we can reposition it on the canvas. And if we have this option up here turned on, moving a page will also move any objects that are touching the page. Turning off the option will keep the objects where they are. If we would like to save our document, we can go to File, Save, or Save As. This will save the document as an Inkscape SVG, and will include all of the information we need to continue working on our document in Inkscape at a later time. We can also use the SVG file on something like a website. For the most part, however, in order to use our designs outside of Inkscape, we'll need to export them to a different format, like a PNG or JPG image file. To do this, we use the Export dialog, which we can open by going to File, Export. In the Export dialog, we have the options of exporting everything inside the page, everything inside the document, everything inside the current selection, or we can define a custom area to export. Down here, we have a checkbox that says Export Selected Only. When this is unchecked, everything inside the selection box will be exported, even objects that aren't actually currently selected. If we check the box, only the actual selected objects will be exported. We also have the option of adding a background color to the export. To export, we can click the folder icon here, give it a name, and choose the export location, choose the format to export to, and click Save. You should now know enough about Inkscape to put it to use in your own designs. But if you would like to go even deeper, as well as get plenty of practice with Inkscape's tools and features, I have a number of full Inkscape courses on my website. I'll leave a link to them in the description box below. Also, be sure to check out the other videos on my channel, which are dedicated to helping you master Inkscape. Thanks for watching.